I still remember the exact moment I realized my grandmother had been lying to me for 31 years. Not in a dramatic way, not with a confrontation or a letter or a deathbed confession. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in late October, in a Tim Hortons off the highway outside of Sudbury, when a woman I had never met in my life looked at me across a laminate table and said, quietly and without any fanfare at all, "Your mother didn't die in that accident. She's been living in Nova Scotia since 1994. I was 31 years old. I had a half-eaten maple dip donut in my hand, and the world I thought I understood simply stopped making the sound it had always made. Let me go back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without it. My name is Vera. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, raised by my grandmother, a woman named Elspeth who was formidable in the way that women of her generation sometimes are. Firm handshake. Never cried at funerals. Made Ukrainian borscht from scratch every Sunday and kept the recipe in her head, never written down, as if even her cooking were a secret she intended to take with her. She told me my mother had died when I was 2 years old. A car accident on the Trans-Canada, somewhere between Sault Ste. Marie and the Ontario border. Icy roads. Winter. The kind of thing that happens in this country and breaks families clean in half. She told me my father had been out of the picture before I was even born, that he was someone my mother had met briefly, and that there was nothing worth knowing about him. She raised me alone. We lived in a bungalow on Lorne Street with a birch tree in the front yard that dropped leaves every September like clockwork. I had a decent childhood. Not warm, exactly, but stable. Fed, clothed, present for every parent-teacher night, every school concert, every minor emergency. I never questioned it. Or rather, I questioned it the way you question things when you are a child, which is to say you ask once, get a short answer, and learn quickly that some topics in your house are walls, not doors. The only thing I had from my mother was a photograph. Black and white, a little blurry, taken sometime in what looked like the late 1980s. A young woman standing in front of what appeared to be a lake, squinting slightly into the sun, laughing at something outside the frame. She had dark hair and a gap between her front teeth that I also have. My grandmother kept it on the mantel. She never talked about it unprompted. When I asked as a teenager what my mother had been like, she said, she was complicated. That was the full extent of the eulogy I ever received. I moved to Toronto when I was 23 for work. Graphic design, mostly contract stuff at first, then a steady job with a mid-size firm downtown. I called my grandmother every Sunday. She asked about the weather and whether I was eating properly. I told her yes, even when the answer was more complicated than that. We had that kind of relationship. She died when I was 28. Stroke, very fast, which is apparently how she would have wanted it. She left me the house on Lorne Street and a small amount of savings, about $40,000, which felt enormous to me at the time, and which I did not touch for almost a year because it felt strange to spend money that still smelled, in some abstract way, like her Sunday soup. I inherited the house and spent a weekend going through her things. That was the first time I found something that didn't quite fit. In the bottom of her closet, inside a shoebox, tucked behind a pair of winter boots she hadn't worn in probably a decade, there was a bundle of envelopes. Not letters. Envelopes. Sealed, stamped, never mailed, all of them addressed in my grandmother's handwriting, to someone named Cecily Marchetti, at an address in Dartmouth, Nova Scotia. I counted them. There were 23. I stood in that closet for a long time. Then I put them back, put the lid on the shoebox, set the box on the shelf above the boots, and drove back to Toronto. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself there were 1,000 explanations. An old friend. A relative I'd never heard of. Someone from her past who had nothing to do with me. I told myself that for almost 3 years. Then my daughter was born. Nothing prepares you for the specific kind of grief that comes with becoming a parent when you don't know where you came from. It's not dramatic. It's quiet, and it catches you at odd moments. Filling out the family medical history form at the hospital, watching my daughter sleep and realizing, I don't know what I looked like at 2 days old, because there are no photos. Answering the question on school forms that says family background, and leaving it blank, not because I don't care, but because I genuinely don't know. My daughter was 4 months old when I drove back to Sudbury, took the shoebox out of the closet, and opened one of the envelopes. It was a letter. My grandmother's handwriting, cramped and deliberate, dated July 2003, when I would have been 10 years old. It began, Cecily. Vera started her period last week. She's healthy. She doesn't ask about you anymore. I hope you understand that this is better for everyone. I sat on the floor of that closet for a very long time. I opened 4 more. They were all like that. Short, factual. Updates about my life written in the tone of a quarterly report. She got into the gifted program. She has a good group of friends. She got a job at the design firm. I should have told you sooner. I still think this is right. Cecily Marchetti. I wrote the name down on my phone. Then I opened my laptop right there on the floor and I started searching. It took me about 40 minutes to find her. Social media is both a miracle and a horror depending on the day. There was a Facebook profile. A woman in her early 60s, dark hair gone mostly silver now, a gap between her front teeth that made my chest seize up in a way I was not expecting. She lived in Dartmouth. She taught piano lessons out of her home. Her profile was public enough that I could see she had 2 cats and a vegetable garden, and that she had posted, the previous Mother's Day, a photo of a candle with the caption, "For the ones we carry silently." I stared at that caption for a long time. I did not contact her right away. I want to be honest about that, because I think people assume that in these situations you act immediately, that the revelation and the response happen in the same breath. They don't. I went home. I made dinner. I fed my daughter. I put her to bed. And then I sat at my kitchen table in Toronto and did not sleep until 3 in the morning. What I kept coming back to was this. My grandmother had known. She had known for my entire life. She had written letters she never sent, which meant she had maintained some kind of contact, or attempted to, which meant there was a version of my history that had been happening parallel to the one I'd been given. A whole other story, running alongside mine, that I had never been allowed to read. I went back to Sudbury a second time 3 weeks later. This time I went to the library. I pulled old newspaper archives. I searched for any accident on the Trans-Canada in 1994 or 1995, matching what my grandmother had described. I found nothing with my mother's name. I found a lot of accidents. Not that one. Then I hired a woman named Deb, who ran a small people search and genealogy service out of an office above a pharmacy on Elm Street. She was about 60, very practical, with reading glasses on a beaded chain, and the kind of manner that suggested she had heard everything, and was surprised by nothing. I gave her the name, the address in Dartmouth, the dates, and the letters. She called me 6 days later and asked if I could come in. That was how I ended up at the Tim Hortons off the highway. Deb had a folder. She set it on the table between us and folded her hands over it, not dramatically, but carefully, the way you do when you're about to say something that you know will change the shape of someone's day. "Your mother didn't die in that accident," she said. "She's been living in Nova Scotia since 1994. I asked her to tell me everything." What Deb had found was this. My mother, Cecily, had been 22 when she had me. She was not married to my father. My father was a man named, and I want to be precise here because this part matters, a man my grandmother had apparently considered deeply unsuitable. For reasons that Deb suspected, but could not confirm, had more to do with his background than his character. He was from a family that had emigrated from Italy. He was Catholic in a way my grandmother, a Ukrainian Anglican, found incompatible. He was, by every account Deb had been able to piece together from public records, and a conversation with a retired neighbor of my grandmother's, a decent and unremarkable man who had simply had the misfortune of not being what my grandmother wanted for her daughter. When I was 2 years old, my grandmother had given my mother what Deb, in her careful neutral phrasing, called a choice. Either she left, gave up custody, and allowed my grandmother to raise me, or my grandmother would make things very difficult. Deb was not specific about what difficult meant, and I did not push her on it in that moment because I was still trying to understand the outline of the story before I got to the texture of it. My mother had left. She had moved to Nova Scotia. She had built a different life. She had apparently never stopped trying to send word back, which was what the unmailed letters suggested. My grandmother receiving communication, composing responses she never sent, maintaining a kind of one-sided surveillance over a relationship she had chosen to end on someone else's behalf. My father's name was in Deb's folder too. He lived in Sault Ste. Marie. He was 64. He had remarried in 2001. He had 2 children from that marriage, which meant I had half-siblings I had never met. I drove home from Sudbury that day with Deb's folder on the passenger seat. I did not turn the radio on. I watched the highway unspool ahead of me through the November gray, the rocks and the trees, and the big Canadian sky, doing nothing to resolve the very particular problem I was now carrying, which was that I was 31 years old, and everything I had been told about where I came from was a careful, sustained, decades-long lie. I want to pause here because I think it's important to be honest about what I felt and what I didn't feel. I did not feel rage, not yet. I felt something more like the experience of being in a room where the furniture has been rearranged in the dark. You're not hurt. You know this room. But nothing is where you left it, and you can't turn the light on, and you have to move very slowly until you find the lamp. I also felt, under everything else, something I was not expecting to feel. Something almost like relief. Because here's the thing about growing up with a version of yourself that doesn't entirely make sense. You spend a lot of time thinking the inconsistency is inside you, that you're the one who doesn't fit, that you're the problem the family can't quite resolve. And the day someone tells you that no, actually, the story you were given was the thing that was wrong, not you, that day something loosens that you didn't even know had been held tight. I sat with everything for 2 weeks before I did anything. My partner, who is patient with me in the way that only people who have known you long enough to understand your particular rhythms can be, let me work through it at my own pace. He made dinner. He took the night feeds with our daughter. He did not push me to talk about it, but he was there when I needed to. The first thing I did was write a letter to my mother. I did not send it. I wrote it the way you write things you are not ready to give yet, to clarify your own thoughts, to find out what you actually want to say before you say it where it can't be unsaid. I wrote 3 drafts. The first one was angry. The second one was sad. The third one was something closer to honest, which is to say it asked more than it stated, and it left room for her to answer in ways I hadn't already scripted. Then I found her email address through her piano lesson website. The contact form had a Gmail address, and I figured that was as public as a phone number in 1994. And I sent it. The subject line said, "My name is Vera, I think you're my mother." She replied within 4 hours. She said, "I know who you are. I have been waiting for this email for a very long time. Please call me whenever you are ready. There is no rush. I will still be here." She gave me her phone number. She gave me her address. She said she wasn't going to fill my inbox with information before I was ready to receive it, and that the only thing she wanted me to know right now was that her leaving had not been something she had wanted. That was all. The rest, she said, could wait for me. I called her the following Sunday. I don't know what I expected. Some part of me, I think, had prepared itself for disappointment. For a woman who was apologetic but distant. For someone who had made peace with the absence and didn't quite know how to open the door now that I was knocking. That is not what I found. She picked up on the second ring. She said my name. Not hello, not is this Vera? Just my name, the way you say the name of something you've been looking for long enough that finding it stops your breath for a second. We talked for 2 hours and 40 minutes. I know because I looked at my phone afterward, the way you check the time after a long sleep, because you need to anchor yourself back to the regular world. She told me about the night my grandmother had sat across from her at that same kitchen table on Lawrence Street, the same table I'd eaten 1,000 meals at, and told her what was going to happen. My mother was 24. She didn't have money. She didn't have a lawyer. She didn't have anyone in her corner. My grandmother had made it very clear what the alternative looked like, and my mother, young and frightened and without resources, had made the decision that she believed at the time was the one that would cause me the least harm. She believed she was choosing my stability over her own presence in my life. She had regretted it every single day since. She had tried twice to contact my grandmother formally, once through a legal aid clinic in Halifax in 1999, and once through a mutual acquaintance from their old neighborhood in 2007. Both times she had been told, one way or another, that I was fine, that I was loved, and that reopening the past would only hurt me. She had believed that, or tried to. She had lit candles on my birthdays. She had made a private ritual out of marking the days I wasn't there for. She had lived with it the way you live with something you can't fix and can't forget, which is to say imperfectly, and with great cost to yourself. I asked her about my father. She was quiet for a moment, then she said he was a good man, that she had loved him, truly, and that what had happened between them after she left had been a casualty of everything else, not a failure of what they had actually been to each other. She said she thought I should know him, that she'd spoken to him, actually, a few months earlier, that in the years since my grandmother died, she had quietly reached back out, trying to put pieces together in case I ever came looking. He knew I might contact him. He had said he would be ready. He had been waiting too. I met my father for the first time on a Saturday in January at a coffee shop in Sault Ste. Marie, about a 4-hour drive from Sudbury. I drove up the day before and stayed at a hotel near the water, which in January in Sault Ste. Marie is frozen and enormous and silver gray and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they're still and cold and bigger than you. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at a table near the window with a coffee he had clearly been nursing for a while because the cup was mostly empty. He was tall, which surprised me, though I don't know why. He had the same dark coloring I do. Olive skin and almost black hair gone silver at the sides, and he stood up when he saw me come through the door, and he stood very still, the way people do when they're trying not to do too much. I shook his hand. His grip was steady but not hard, the grip of someone being careful. He said, "I'm glad you came. Not I'm your father or I can't believe this moment. Just I'm glad you came," and somehow that was exactly right. We sat for 3 hours. He told me about his family, about growing up in a house full of noise and Sunday dinners that took all afternoon, about his parents who had both died now but who would have, he said, been absolutely wild about meeting me. He told me about how he had met my mother, and what it had been like when she left, and how he had carried the knowledge of my existence, like something he couldn't put down and couldn't fully hold either. He had 2 kids, a son who was 22 and a daughter who was 19. Both of them already told, already curious, already sending tentative messages via Instagram that I had not yet answered. My half-brother had my hands. I found this out from a photo my father showed me on his phone, and it knocked the air out of me for a second in a way I hadn't expected. It's strange, meeting the people you're made of when you're already an adult. There's no childhood to share. No shared vocabulary of experience, no years of ordinary proximity to fall back on. You have to build something out of the present tense alone. That is both harder and more intentional than growing up with people. Every conversation is a choice. Every phone call is something you're constructing deliberately, not something that simply happens because you're under the same roof. I flew to Dartmouth in March to meet my mother in person for the first time. Or for the first time I can remember, which is not the same thing but is the only version I have. She met me at the airport. She had told me what she'd be wearing, a green jacket, a yellow scarf, and I spotted her before she saw me, which gave me about 30 seconds of watching her scan the arrivals area, with the particular focused attention of someone who is looking for a face they have memorized from a photograph, and are hoping the photograph was accurate. Then she saw me, and her face did something I don't have a clean word for. Not a smile, exactly. Something more fundamental than that. Something that happened below the level of expression. She opened her arms and I walked into them, and we stood like that in the arrivals terminal for longer than was probably practical. And neither of us said anything because there was nothing to say yet that wouldn't have been smaller than what the moment actually was. She lived in a modest semi-detached near the water, the kind of neighborhood where the houses are close together, and everyone seems to know which car belongs to which driveway. She had a piano in her living room that took up a third of the space, and a cat named Douglas, who was enormous and completely uninterested in my arrival. She had photographs on her walls, and I looked at all of them while she made tea, searching the faces for the ones that might be relatives, for the visual evidence of where I fit in the chain. There was a framed photo on a shelf above the piano. A little girl, maybe 2 years old, sitting on someone's lap in a garden. Dark hair. Gap between her front teeth already visible even at that age. I asked her who it was. She set the teapot down carefully. She said, "That's you. Your grandmother sent it in 1996. It was the only one." I sat with that for a long time. We talked for 2 days straight, the way you talk when you have 30 years to cover, and a finite amount of time to be in the same room. She told me about her life, the whole of it, the parts that happened before me, and the parts that happened in parallel to me without my knowledge. She had a best friend named June, who had been with her since nursing school, and who knew the whole story, and had apparently been furious on my behalf for decades. She had a garden she spent every summer in. She had built something real and good out of the aftermath of a decision she hadn't truly wanted to make. She had kept things, not in an obsessive way, not in a way that felt unhinged or unhealthy, but in the way of someone who understands that keeping is sometimes the only form of hope available to you. Birthday cards she had written and never sent. A copy of the school photo my grandmother had mailed in 2003, the one where I have braces and a slightly too large sweater. A printout from my design firm's website, the one with a small headshot and my professional bio, which she had found sometime around 2018 and printed and kept in a folder. There were 29 items in that folder. I counted them later after she had gone to bed, sitting at her kitchen table with a mug of tea that had gone cold. 29 small pieces of a life she had been watching from the outside. I am 31 now. My daughter is 8 months old. She has my gap between her front teeth and her great-grandmother's eyes, which is to say my mother's eyes, which is to say the eyes I had been looking at in a blurry black and white photograph on a mantle for 29 years without knowing whose they were. My mother flew to Toronto in April to meet her. She sat on our couch and held her for an hour and a half and said very little. She didn't need to. Some things are self-explanatory. I have a relationship with my father now that is still finding its shape, the way new things do. We text more than we call. He sends me articles about design, which I find both touching and slightly overwhelming. My half-siblings and I have moved from Instagram to actual conversations, which feels like progress. My half-brother, who does in fact have my hands, I confirmed this in person, is studying architecture at Carleton and is frankly funnier than I was prepared for, which helps. My mother and I talk every week, sometimes for a long time. Sometimes just for a few minutes, a quick check-in, the domestic shorthand of people who are building a habit of contact. She is teaching my daughter to notice music, which my daughter responds to with the total body engagement that babies bring to everything they find interesting, which is to say arms and legs going simultaneously. I have thought about my grandmother a great deal in the past 3 years. Not simply with anger, though there has been some of that, worked through slowly and without resolution, because some things don't resolve so much as become less sharp with time. She was a woman of her era, with fears of her era, with a particular kind of control that I think she confused with love, because she had never been taught the difference. She gave me a stable childhood. She did not give me the truth. Both of those things can be real at the same time. The 23 letters she never sent are still in the shoebox in the closet in the house on Lorne Street. I have not been able to throw them away. I have also not been able to read all of them. Someday, maybe. Or maybe some things are better left as evidence without examination. I haven't decided yet. What I know is this. I was 31 years old, sitting in a Tim Hortons off the highway in northern Ontario with a half-eaten donut in my hand, and a woman I had hired to find a name in a shoebox told me that the story I had been living was not the whole story. And instead of that being the thing that broke me, it turned out to be the thing that finally, after 3 decades, made me whole. Not because the ending is simple. It isn't. Not because all the damage was undone. It wasn't. But because the people I was made of had been looking for me, quietly and steadily, across 30 years and several provinces, and one woman's determined certainty that she knew best. They kept looking, and when I finally started looking back, they were right there. That's the part I carry with me now. Not the lies, not the shoebox, not the cold tea. The part I carry is that some people do not stop. Some people write 29 things into a folder and keep it on a shelf because they believe, even without any evidence that it will ever matter, that someday it might. They were right.